Hello, my friends. Today is a good day. We are going to be talking about one of the early American car manufacturers that didn't make it past the 50s. A car maker that was considered one of the 3 Ps of luxury. And if you haven't guessed it already, we are going to be talking all about the Packard. So, let's do it. Perhaps you're not familiar with this channel. Welcome. It's all about automotive history. And if that's your cup of tea like it is mine, you can press subscribe. It doesn't feel like I'm saying that right whatsoever. Press subscribe or like, and if you don't, well, that's just fine too. And let's begin our story, shall we? We'll go all the way back to 1899 when the Packard brothers, James and William, were talking smack about a Winton horseless carriage. You see, James was none too impressed with his Winton horseless carriage, and he went ahead and sent a list of recommendations to Winton, to which they replied, "Why don't you build a car yourself?" That is just not how you handle customer service. And James Packard said challenge accepted, and November 6th of 1899, the first car, the Packard car, was built in Warren, Ohio. Oh, this is a very similar tale to when Ferruccio Lamborghini, who was making buku bucks building tractors. If you didn't know, Lamborghini started with tractors. Well, Ferruccio had bought the leading sports car of the time, a Ferrari, and he was none too pleased with the frequent and long service visits he was making to Maranello, and he told Enzo about it. To which Enzo Ferrari said, "What would you know? You just build tractors." And that was the birth of the Lamborghini. So something to learn here. And soon, within 4 years, the Packard brothers would have built 400 cars at their factory. Which that might not sound like a tremendous amount to you right now, but back then, that was some serious production. Now, I do want to point out that the Packard brothers did come from a manufacturing background. They had created Packard Electric Company. Did I get that right? I think I did. In 1890, producing incandescent carbon arc lamps. And now, that was really not unusual back then in the early automotive game. If you had any kind of manufacturing background or not, you were like, man, maybe I should get into this. Similar to, I had mentioned the 3 Ps. Well, one of the other Ps, Pierce Arrow, actually got its start by manufacturing and producing Victorian bird cages. So how's that for a jump? I learned that little factoid about Pierce Arrow at the Revs Institute in Naples, Florida. You got to check out the Revs Institute, an amazing museum. Packard cars would soon catch the attention of a gentleman named Henry Bourne Joy, who was born into one of the wealthiest and oldest families in Detroit. And they caught his attention in kind of a wild way. You see, he was in New York City for a work trip, and he saw 2 Packards chase down a horse-drawn fire truck. And after he saw that performance, I don't know what was going on. Maybe the horse was out of control. Maybe who knows what. But after he saw the mayhem in the streets of New York City, he went out and bought the only Packard that was available for sale in town. And Henry Bourne Joy was hooked. He was hooked on Packard's reliability and performance, so much so that he went straight to Warren, Ohio, met with the Packard brothers, talked them into taking on a group of investors, and boom, the Packard Motor Car Company was born. Something to note, which quickly delineated Packard from the rest, was many contemporary cars were $500 to $1,500 for the time. Packard's price was just about double that. It was clear that they were elevating themselves to the most affluent of buyers, and also, really, their only competition was from overseas. Rolls-Royce, Mercedes, Bentley. It would be soon, though, that American luxury competition would be rolling in with the McFarlane, the Peerless, and the Pierce Arrow. Now, I'd already mentioned the 3 Ps. Well, if you haven't already guessed it, the 3 Ps of early American luxury were Packard, Peerless, and Pierce Arrow. Now, let's talk about where Packard's famous motto or slogan came from. How did they devise the slogan, "Ask a man who owns one"? Well, kind of accidental. Rumor has it that their sales skyrocketed so quickly that they kind of ran out of brochures. And a gentleman in Pittsburgh called wanting to inquire about the latest literature that he could possibly get about Packard, to which a flustered secretary ran into James Packard's office, said, "What should I give this gentleman?" To which James Packard simply said, "I'm sorry, we're all out of it. Just tell him to ask a man who owns one." And the famous slogan was born, just like that. Now, I think something that's very important to keep in mind here is that the average day person, consumer, they were very skeptic at this time about whether they actually wanted this horseless carriage. You see, they didn't necessarily think that a car was any better than a horse and carriage at the time. And what early car makers had to do was prove that this mode of transportation was reliable and preferable. Packard set out to do just that. They were the first car to drive across the country. The press, the public, everybody was enthralled. And this is when Packard cemented their reputation for performance and reliability. And frankly, that entire endeavor sounds like a testament. Do you know there were no roads? The U.S. interstate highway system was not around till 1956. So if you're trying to drive anywhere outside of a major hub, like, impossible. Obviously not impossible, but very, very difficult. This is a little side note, but it's very interesting and pertinent. Now, Henry Bourne Joy, the guy that talked the Packard brothers into taking on investors, well, he would later on in life heavily support the creation of a transatlantic highway, the Lincoln Highway. He believed that we needed a reliable road across the U.S., and we did. And it also didn't hurt that the more roads meant the more cars would probably be sold. Henry Bourne Joy said he considered the Lincoln Highway the greatest thing he ever did. And now let's go ahead and move on to the introduction of the Model L. And with the Model L would also be the introduction of Packard's distinctive grille that would follow along for many more models to come. Packard was the first car maker to be able to produce 1,000 cars in 1 year, which was a major achievement for the time. Now, let's talk about just about every early Packard was named for its horsepower. The Model 24, 24 horsepower. Now, the Model 24 also was called the mile-a-minute car because it could reach 60 miles per hour within a minute. Now, let's fast forward to the Packard Twin Six, the first 12-cylinder engine for a production vehicle, which essentially was two 6-cylinder motors set on one crankshaft. The Packard Twin Six revolutionized the automotive arena. An engine like that had never been built before. The Packard Twin Six was actually the basis for the Liberty aircraft engine used in World War I. In 1928, Packard bought 340 acres. They spent $1 million on the finest and newest of technology. And they made the dopest proving ground for their automobiles of its time. Also, it was one of the first proving grounds. The track had such a perfect bank that it was said you could take your hands off the wheel and drive into the curve at full throttle. The Packard Proving Grounds became known as one of the fastest speedways. And it wasn't just a track they had. They had every kind of condition you could imagine for them to test their Packards. Oh, the future seemed so bright. Packard had made $25 million in profit. They were at the height of American luxury automotives. They had a really dope proving ground. But I think we all know what follows 1928. In October of 1929, the stock market absolutely plummeted, and the desire for anything luxury plummeted too. But instead of dialing down, Packard went ahead and turned up the notch, and they were creating bigger and better cars, bigger motors, and customized bodies by Dietrich and LeBaron. The Packards that were built in this time are considered some of the most beautiful Packards ever. And they kept that pedal to the metal strategy going for a while, And then they kind of realized that maybe the Depression was going to be around for a little bit longer than they all anticipated. And that's when they decided that they ought to come out with something a little more economic. And they introduced the 120. And the affordable 120 was a hit. It set an all-time sales record for Packard. Now let's go ahead and fast forward to 1941 when Packard introduced the Clipper. Now the Clipper was designed by prolific designer and playboy Dutch Darren. And if the Darren name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you are thinking of the Kaiser Darren, that little adorable sports car with the funky slide pocket doors. Love that. 1 year later, after the introduction of the Clipper, well, the U.S. government would sanction all car makers from making cars. Yes, from 1942 to 1945, all car makers would stop making cars and completely switch to the war effort. Now, get this. At one point, Stalin asked President Roosevelt if he could give Russia the tooling for the older styled Packards. During the war, Rolls-Royce reached out to Packard and asked if they would assist them in producing their Merlin aviation engines. You see, Packard had a reputation worldwide for reliability, and Packard did not disappoint. They produced 55,000 Merlin engines. All right, it is the end of World War II, and people want new cars. All right, they haven't had new cars since 1942. All right, pre-war. And all Packard has to give them, and while they're frantically preparing a new car, is just kind of the Clipper, which was what every other car maker was pretty much doing, because they had too been sanctioned against producing any new cars. They were just selling what they had before while they were frantically planning for a new one. And in 1948, Packard would be able to introduce its first new car since World War II. Did it sell a ton? Yes. 98,000. Did it get the nickname as the bathtub? Yes. It may have sold a lot, but it was not anywhere near the styling and refinement that Packard was known for. But just a few years later, in 1952, Packard would cause such a sensation with their Pan American show car that they had to do something about it. They had to build something to keep the public happy. And thus, the birth of the Packard Caribbean in 1953. Do you say Caribbean or Caribbean? Let me know. And it was with the Caribbean that Packard took back its reputation for style. Something to think about is that the 1950s were a tough time for smaller car makers. You see, the big three were engaging in a price war. They were flooding the market with their cars and severely underpricing them as well. Packard's CEO, James Nance, thought the only way to survive was for these smaller car makers to band together. And that was Nash, Hudson, and Studebaker. And it seems like the deal could have happened until, unfortunately, the main guy at Nash, George Mason, passed away before the deal was sealed. And his successor, George Romney, yes, Mitt's dad, said, no way. And so George Romney said, screw Studebaker and Packard, and only teamed up with Hudson, thus creating American Motor Corporation. And so Studebaker and Packard joined forces, and it didn't go too swimmingly. Neither one really realized how dire the other one was off financially. And then in 1955, Packard had some serious quality issues that resulted in a lot of warranty repairs that plunged the company $30 million into the red. And so they're both in trouble. Studebaker and Packard are grasping for straws, and they introduce a car called the Packard Baker. Not a great name, but kind of a cool looking car. But it wasn't enough to save them. And in 1959, one of the greatest American luxury brands of all time, a car maker that had forged style and design for decades, one of the 3 Ps of American luxury, was done. And its end announced with just a mere press release. Thanks a lot, Big Three, for that 1950s price war. I'm just kidding. Obviously, there were issues and problems building up that led to this, too. Well, what is your favorite Packard? What do you think of the Clipper? What other American automotive manufacturers that were ahead of its time that never made it out of the 50s? Or also never made it past the 1930s from the Great Depression? All right, friends. Well, I hope you enjoyed this quick little and informal rendezvous in Packard's history. If you like this kind of thing, press like, press subscribe, and if you don't, that's fine too. All right, bye.